When Kentaro Miura, the author of a little known series called King Berserk, was asked about his thoughts on shoujo manga, he said that the themes of love, friendship, and complex relationships in his work all reflected shoujo elements that helped him take Berserk from just being an action-driven story to being a story with a vast amount of emotional depth. The quote that really stood out to me being, "I was influenced by shoujo in terms of portraying characters' delicate emotions and psychological complexities." And if you haven't realized it yet, these aren't little compliments. Nobody likes Berserk for the action, even though, you know, big guy swings sword. Cool. Really, it's exploring those connections and how Guts evolves around them is what makes Berserk feel like such a profound series. And to dedicate most of your influence in that area, which he said numerous times over his life, to shoujo is, you know, kind of insane, and Miura isn't alone in this sentiment. Another less popular example of this being Yoshihiro Togashi, the guy that made two of the most critically acclaimed shonen of all time, Hunter x Hunter and Yu Yu Hakusho, who's also spoken about how he appreciates the way shoujo manga delves into the emotional aspect of characters to add depth to his characters' relationships and show personal growth. And listen, you know, I could go on and on and on about the huge male authors that have been influenced heavily by shoujo. Kubo, who made Bleach, Inio Asano, the guy that wrote Oyasumi Punpun, Obata, who drew Death Note, or another personal favorite of mine, Urasawa, who's made some of my own favorite stories of all time, Monster and 20th Century Boys. All of which make a similar point to Miura and Togashi, that being inspired by shoujo is what helped take their stories to the next level, from both a visual and storytelling perspective. Listen, the point is shoujo has impact, influence, and profoundness within the manga industry, and have directly influenced the stories that so many men look up to, and use to inspire how they live their own lives. And that brings me to a very important question. Why the are guys not reading it anymore? What happened to the phrase, if you want to really learn from somebody, look at who they admire? In the May of 2020, a survey was conducted amongst 709 Japanese students about what type of manga they read, with the main focus on identifying the different types of preferences between boys and girls. When the girls were asked, it found that around 90% of them had read shonen or seinen manga at least one point in their life. However, when the boys were asked, it found that only around 20% of them have ever picked up a shoujo or josei manga at any point in their lives. Now remember, this is from a Japanese high school where reading a manga magazine is as common as a white girl buying a pumpkin spice triple deluxe frappuccino with a cherry on top in the West. By the way, I don't know if that's actually a thing. So I think it's safe to say that the number of guys that read shoujo outside of Japan is probably way less. And if you've been in the anime and manga community for more than, 32 seconds, you probably know that these statistics reflect the state of things here quite accurately. Now listen, I bring all this up not to say that there's anything wrong with shonen or seinen. As a matter of fact, if I'm being honest, most of my favorite series fall under that category, but it's more that I've taken issue with this overemphasis on demographics. That isn't an issue with just shoujosei. Another common example of this is people assuming that a seinen is automatically better than a shonen just because it's a seinen and vice versa, which at the end of the day, like all demographics, they have their high highs and low lows. And I mean lows. And that's why I have a distaste for this barrier that's been created between shoujo and shonen, as a result of a lot of guys just assuming it's nothing more than high school romance, which I promise you could not be more wrong about. In truth, some of my favorite stories ever fall into the shoujo and josei demographic, and more importantly, it provides a vastly different experience that I think affects you positively in a different way that something like a typical shonen does. There is something to gain. Just like Miura and Togashi mentioned, shoujo specializes in delving into human relationships and articulating the many different unexplainable emotions we experience towards others, and in turn different aspects of ourselves, encompassing both the positive and negative. And forgive me if I sound pretentious, I really think that's what guys need these days, especially when you look at the current state of the world. The specifics of all this will be broken down throughout the video, obviously, but that's the very dumbed down idea behind this video. Okay, I've waffled as to why shoujo, but when discussing a word that's been around since 7th century Japan and has changed numerous times over the years, what the actual is shoujo? Because like I said, a lot of people have a very wrong misconception about it. First things first, it is a target audience and not a genre, but like shonen, it's been around for a very long time. And during that time, it's developed its own unique visual and narrative characteristics, enough to make it stand out as its own thing. In shonen, examples of this would be the common narrative focus on coming of age stories, rivalries, unattainable dreams, and with its art, it would be the rigid box-to-box panels, over-the-top character designs, power and energy effects, etc. All of this the result of manga artists over many years developing art characteristics that aims to enhance the experience of action-driven storytelling in the manga medium. And with shoujo, you can already see hints of that when looking at its definition. Shoujo is a demographic of Japanese comics and animated films aimed primarily at a young female audience, typically characterized by a focus on interpersonal relationships. This starts to give us an idea of what shoujo is. The answer as to why I developed manga around this lies all the way back in late 19th century to early 20th century Japan, a time when before we had our beloved Shonen Jump and instead had literature magazines like Shonen Sakai, which translates to Boys World, which, and I don't know about you, sounds a little bit weird. These early magazines were full of short poems, novels, stories, and art. Sorry, I just, the thought of just stories with no pictures. In those magazines, shoujo was only a subsection that was limited to just stuff that provided moral guidance, a focus on simple relationships, and ultimately trying to just emphasize respect and hard work for young women, which ended up putting a lot of stories it produced into a very tiny box. And the effects of this can be seen in the early days of shoujo manga as a whole in the 50s and 60s, with stories still focusing on these normative values, like familial relationships. That of a mother and daughter was a common one, for example. Fun fact, even with legendary authors making shoujo at the time, like Chiba, the artist of one of my favorite stories of all time, Ashita no Joe, and a little guy called Osamu Tezuka, which outside of being credited for single-handedly pioneering the media of manga as a whole, was the guy that announced the great Akira Toriyama as his predecessor. So, yeah, he's big. They were still just outputting very mediocre stories, especially when compared to their other works, which after reading some and just reading descriptions of it in general, I can personally confirm, was very mid. It was only in the late 60s to early 70s where shoujo really started to become what we see today as a result of the introduction of manga competitions, bringing us a lot more women to actually write stories about women. I mean, you'd think it's a no-brainer, but it's just the times, mate. These years are remembered as the peak golden years of shoujo, which, I personally don't agree with, as you'll figure out later, but it's safe to say it's here where it had the biggest impact on the manga medium as a whole, producing stories like Rose of Versailles, which Miura credits as being one of his huge inspirations when writing Berserk, Attack Number 1, one of the first times we started seeing sports manga do really well, or a personal favourite of mine, Glass Mask, which, fun fact, is still on hiatus to this day. Why is every manga I like on hiatus, bro? Like, please, every one of them! Ultimately introducing so many different types of genre for shoujo. And after looking into and reading a lot of these stories, it felt like to me they were saying no, feelings, relationships, connections aren't simple, and that's very important to acknowledge. I mean, and it is true, I'm still trying to figure out what type of relationship I have with my dad, even though I've never seen him before. Dad? I think I might have gone a bit off topic, but the answer to what shoujo is can be summed up nicely in the book Shoujo Cross Media, a very thorough study about shoujo as a whole, where they specifically mention how shoujo separates itself from other demographics, summarizing it as, I believe that these differences work together to make shoujo manga a genre which is more personal than romance, with a focus on feeling and a connection with, and empathy towards both the characters and to a lesser degree, authors, whereas shonen manga is more typified by its strong orientation to plot. Okay, now that we've established how shoujo separates itself from other demographics as its own thing, we can dive deeper into the specifics of why I think reading it would benefit any guy greatly. The first aspect of which can be found in how men are portrayed in shoujo compared to shonen. Now, if you've read a lot of shonen, you probably know that it's common to see main characters fall under the trope of being ignorant of other people's emotions, as a result of either them just being plain stupid, or it just not being a priority for them in their journey. A popular example I can think of is when the MC is oblivious to a girl who very clearly is in love with them. Rich people struggles, man, I know. Another common trope in shonen guys is that on some level they're usually characterized by physical strength and stoic attributes. And this is really just the shonen staple at this point, the emphasis on reaching your goals and the struggle against underwhelming odds. Now this isn't a bad thing by any means. Personally, I'll eat that shit up any day of the week, but it's more about understanding that this is only one type of portrayal, one type of perspective. The other perspective can be found in shoujo guys, who are portrayed with much more of an emphasis on their ability to communicate, express vulnerability, and navigate complex emotions, or at least that's what they're working towards. One example of this being how they show a lot more sensitivity to those around them, both physically and how they're a lot more delicate, shown through the touch of hands, and visually with the use of tones, to create a lot more of a soft and intimate aura surrounding them. Yes, there's more than one type of aura, and that seems to get pushed to the side by a lot of guys who think that guys in shoujo are just the fantasies of teenage girls, which I mean, I could see why you think that. Let's not lie, these motherfuckers are way better looking than you or me, and I feel like even I at some point had that perspective, but honestly it's kind of a very shallow thought. It's not understanding why these guys are so appealing and interesting to its target audience. A recent example of this can be found in A Sign of Affection, a story about Yuki, a deaf girl in college trying to go beyond her safe environment and build new connections. Whilst the series was airing last January, I saw a lot of guys on social media who seemed to resonate a lot more with the secondary love interest, Oshi, a long-time childhood friend of Yuki who doesn't want her to get out of her comfort zone and interact with other people who don't know sign language because he doesn't want her to get hurt, and instead calling Itsumi, the main love interest, a bland character for the simple fact that he's instantly appealing to both Yuki and the audience. When in reality, Itsumi has a lot more nuance to his character than just how he looks, and you can see hints of that even when we see him for the first time in the manga. The truth is, Oshi was essentially the antagonist in the series for the pure reason that he tried to keep Yuki in a box, whilst Itsumi not only wanted to share his world with her, but also made efforts to understand and expand the world she'd experienced so far, with his main way of doing so being in how he prioritizes empathy and emotional understanding of Yuki by allowing himself to be vulnerable around her. And even though Oshi was way better at sign language than Itsumi, he never made an effort beyond just knowing the same language as her. It was clear that he pitied her in a lot of areas, all as a result of his pride and ego. And that's the difference men can take away from these stories. A model of masculinity that prioritizes empathy and emotional understanding, that at its core stems from the ability to be vulnerable with those around you, with those you care about. But what I don't want this to sound like is me just saying, you know, oh, be vulnerable for the sake of it, you little fucking bitch. It means giving something everything you've got, and in turn being susceptible to failure. And after reading so many of these stories and doing a little bit of my own research, I'm sure the key to self-actualization, the realization or fulfillment of one's talent and potentials, is by opening yourself up. One of my favourite examples of vulnerability and how it's related to trauma is Kyo Soma from Fruits Basket. He's a perfect representation of what a lot of psychologists refer to as avoidant attachment, an attachment style typically associated with men. Going off this article by Very Well Mind, it's characterised by having a discomfort with emotional intimacy, a strong desire for independence, and difficulty wholly trusting others. In other words, the person avoids getting too close to someone else. This means that people with avoidant attachment are often emotionally unavailable and struggle to emotionally invest in a relationship. And that's something I feel like Fruits Basket tackles directly. Just in case you've never heard of it, which I don't know how you haven't, it's basically the most popular shoujo out there. It revolves around a girl called Toru Honda, a high school girl who, after her mother passed away and is now living in a tent, is eventually taken in by the Soma family, who are cursed in that they are possessed with the spirits of 12 Chinese zodiac animals and transform into these animals when they are hugged by someone of the opposite sex or when they are under extreme stress. Each member of the family represents one of the zodiac animals, with Kyo representing the cat. Now, Kyo's situation is like very specifically bad because the cat is not traditionally a part of the Chinese zodiac, but is included in the Soma family curse due to an old legend where the rat tricked the cat out of attending the banquet, leading to it being excluded from the zodiac. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he kind of turns into a big ass monster every time he takes his bracelet off. As a result of all this, Kyo is considered an outcast within the family and holds a very deep resentment towards them. And if you've watched Fruits Basket, you know that this isn't some case of, oh, you know, you're not one of us, fuck off. This is emotional abuse to the highest degree imaginable. They implement a very deep self-hatred into him, making it clear that he's nothing more than a burden, a curse to the family. And on top of that, his mother's suicide and his father blaming all of his problems on him gives him this idea that he only causes pain for others. And whether you think he was tricked into thinking this or acts this way as a result of his trauma, it does physically manifest itself as a part of his personality as he grows up. Now, the point of all of this is to explain that at the start of Fruits Basket, Kyo does not want connections. He closes himself off as a defense mechanism that stems from two things: an anger at the world for being treated the way he has, and a deep-rooted sense of worthlessness and self-hatred. He's somebody who doesn't believe he could be loved. He's a deconstruction of the tsundere character archetype that really tells us why a character like that acts the way they do. Which, now that I think about it, is actually kind of funny that tsunderes are usually associated with girls in manga, because, you know, if you look at statistics and kind of just think about it, guys are way more likely to exhibit the traits of a tsundere. And linking it back to Kyo, this isn't a self-actualized person. This isn't the true form of anybody. It's a person who's been defined by the negative experiences in their lives, and ultimately a person who's been defined by fear. The truth is, we crave connections, real meaningful connections, and that's something that's hardwired into our biology. And that's even more so the case with avoidant people. Kyo as a child wasn't like this. He was described as being a kind person, a warm person, a welcoming person. And throughout the series, you still see hints that that part of himself still exists. He still on some level wanted to be accepted by the Soma family, and takes a deal to come back even if it means going around and hurting people for it. But it also links into this defense mechanism avoidant people have, because in his own words, it fueled the hatred that kept him alive. Now this all culminates in his journey with Toru, which, you know, a bit of a side note, I absolutely adore. Like, there is a good chance she might be my favorite character of all time, who Kyo specifically went out of his way not to get close to, making sure to put the same barrier up. However, Toru, even though I'm already simplifying her very underrated character in my opinion, is characterized as the complete opposite of this. She's willing to throw everything she has at people and can be open and vulnerable. She has no ego, and that's an important word I'll come back to in the next section. There's a misinterpretation that Toru fixed him, but that's not how I see it. Toru accepted him and therefore gave him an avenue to open up and to also be vulnerable, and that's how he was able to overcome his trauma. He explores his emotions, finds sides of him that he'd forgotten existed, until ultimately revealing who he truly was all along. And that's why I make the claim that vulnerability is the path to self-actualization. Finding people to be vulnerable with and actually being vulnerable to them reveals who you really are. Now, for some reason, it's really hard to find shoujo author interviews, especially when compared to how easy it is to find shonen ones, but luckily I was able to find some from Natsuki Takaya, the creator of Fruits Basket, with her response to the question, what inspires the Fruits Basket storyline, being what stood out to me the most. I've been asked this question many times in the past, but I still don't have a very clear answer to it. It's just something that occurs to me through the process of living for myself, as me. That being said, everything I've said about Kyo can very easily be applied to men. It's also really general in that anybody with a shit childhood could probably relate to him on some level. Focusing more on the man part of this video, another aspect of shoujo that I'd like to discuss is how it dives surprisingly deep into masculinity. This obviously includes the emphasis on vulnerability and intimacy that I've already mentioned, but it also includes stripping people and their emotions down to their very core, which is what we see with a lot of the men in these series. The most recent example of this for me was when I read Nana for the first time earlier this year. Now, if you've been living under a rock and you've never heard of this series, the best way to describe it, even though I know it's going to piss off a lot of its fans, is what Berserk is to men, Nana is for women. By the way, if you think this video was secretly at how many times you can mention Berserk challenge in 30 minutes, you're not wrong. Nana's raw and very visceral take on the slice of life genre serves as a cautionary tale for a lot of women. But just like there's a shit ton of women with brand of sacrifice tattoos, there's a lot men can take out of this series. To give a quick summary of what the story is about, Nana is about two 19-year-old girls with the same name, Nana, who meet by chance on a train and happen to become roommates in Tokyo. One is a punk rock singer trying to make it big, whilst the other is a very naive girl seeking love. Once again, it's a really raw slice of life story that explores their friendship, love lives, and struggles as they navigate a very f***ed up adulthood and try to pursue their own dreams. And for the sake of this video, I'll be referring to the pink Nana as Hachi, her nickname in the show because everybody seems to think that she acts like a dog called Hachiko, and the punk rock Nana as just Nana. Fun fact, by the way, the first time I recorded this section, I called them Black Nana and Pink Nana, and then I realized how stupid that sounded. The best way I can sum up my experience reading Nana is that it was genuinely one of the most raw and visceral fictional experiences I've ever had. I keep saying that word raw because, you know, I don't think I'm smart enough to describe it any other way. You know, it starts off pretty okay and then boom, Adolf hit, this guy comes. And from there, it just gets worse and worse and even worse in the manga, and it hits a low and then goes on hiatus for 10 years. The point is that after catching up to this series and going down an Ai Yazawa rabbit hole, the one thing I can comfortably say about her is that she is clearly somebody who has been through a shit ton of trauma. I don't think you can write these type of stories without having some experience firsthand. You can feel that every character she writes is based off an experience, and with that she's able to create one of the most intricate deep dive into character psychology I've ever seen, up there with the likes of Urasawa. The main thing I took away from Nana is that if you don't understand yourself, you'll never be able to understand other people, which is a lot more of a complicated idea than it seems, and using that as the foundation is a huge part of that message, with the focus on Nana Osaki. The series makes it clear that Nana has a provider complex towards Hachi, taking on a traditionally masculine role whilst Hachi assumes a more feminine one. There's numerous examples of this throughout the series, one of which is that Nana often expresses her desire to buy a house, pay for their meals, and handle financial responsibilities, ultimately emphasizing this dynamic in their relationship. And expanding on that, at the beginning of the series, Hachi is presented to be the weaker of the two. She relies on others to find any sort of self-worth, and even though her want for romance isn't entirely a negative thing, her optimism and positivity about it becomes a negative due to the fact that she constantly allows herself to be taken advantage of. And that's why she looks up to Nana so much, because on a surface level, she seems like a very confident, independent person. She doesn't seem to care about what other people think, and with that, doesn't seem to rely on anyone whatsoever. Rather, people rely on her. Because Nana is portrayed with a masculine personality that I found her to be very relatable, you start to see the cautionary aspects of her character. As the layer of both of these characters get peeled off and we get deeper into the narrative, we see that this dynamic is completely the opposite. Hachi, through all the bad shit she goes through, always comes back, remaining firm and never losing the one thing that's most valuable to anybody, the will to improve and be better for the people she cares about. Whilst Nana has a very Yeah, why can't I say the word, bro? Possessive. Has a very possessive nature, which has her constantly running away from her problems and anything she can't control, mainly people, ultimately leading to this constant self-sabotage. A lot of the time, it seems like she's barely holding herself together. One example of this possessiveness in play is how she loves being Hachi's hero, and if anything damages that idea, she starts to break down. And it's this possessiveness that leads me to one conclusion, that all of the problems she faces revolves around one thing, her ego. She cares so much about playing into an idea that she can't bring herself to open up and be emotionally honest to Hachi or anybody else that's important to her. And ironically, because of that, in the end, she's basing her self-worth on the views of other people. This dynamic to me is so well written and brings up an idea that I've had in the back of my mind for a very long time, in that you understand yourself through other people just as much as you do through endeavors, and it's up to you whether you can actively acknowledge that or simply turn a blind eye to it. How you treat other people and how you act in response to love says something about who you are and what you value. Are you somebody that can let go of their ego in an attempt to get closer to somebody, or are you going to always hold them at a distance? Both Nanas are by every means a cautionary and hopeful tale in terms of how they deal with their flaws, but in polar opposite directions. Hachi doesn't hide her weaknesses, but Nana does, and they both suffer for it. But what separates them from being a cautionary tale and a heroic one stems from the understanding they have of themselves. Nana doesn't want people to see her weakness, and therefore wants to control her connections. And all of this is a result of Nana not really understanding her trauma, showing these toxic masculine traits of simply disregarding it. Whilst Hachi is more of a heroic tale, as she tries to improve on herself and overcome her flaws. This might be a bit of a batshit crazy comparison, but Nana reminds me a little bit of BoJack in that she has all the tools to improve herself, but doesn't. Another example of this is her possessive relationship with Ren, because he's the only one that can bring any sort of weakness out of her. She fears him and puts a lock pad around his neck as this last attempt to control him. By the way, just a really random side note, I'm British, this might surprise a lot of people. Never heard about the Sex Pistols before this, but apparently Ren and Nana are based on these two people called Sid and Nancy, and I was like, oh, cool, let's do some research. Holy shit, bro. This, I ended up watching a TV show, watching documentaries. Shit was bad, bro. This shit was bad. And ultimately, the point of all of this is to reaffirm the fact that Nana is a cautionary tale. The same way Sid Vicious was and the same way Nancy was. So anyways, back to the topic. Even though everything I've said in this section seems to paint Nana as this really depressing story, which, to some extent it is, you can't get around that. The beauty of Nana and why you should read it, even if it never does finish, which I'm optimistic it does. Please, Ayazawa, come back. I miss you. Can be found at the heart of the story in the relationship between both Nanas. And all of this can be summarized in my favorite quote throughout the entire 40 episodes and 89 chapters I read.
Hey Hachi, no matter how much or how often people hurt each other, loving someone is never a waste. That love letter you left for me back then, I still cherish it.
Every person comes with a lesson, whether that be a good or a bad one, and I think it's important to express your love in the most honest and open way that you can with the people that you care about, and not let fear, trauma, pride, or ego get in the way of that. And that's what I've been trying to say with this video, I think. Was I good at saying it? I don't know. I don't know if I'm good at this. But anyways, this brings me on to my final section. When it comes to why guys don't read shoujo, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that this stems from a complex that guys aren't willing to let go of when it comes to reading female-oriented media as a whole. Now, going off my own experience with my friends, whom, trust me, I have tried for years to get into these series, the refusal to get into shoujo and josei, although it's a little bit less prominent, stems from an assumption that there won't be anything relatable or meaningful within them. There's a fear that these series will mainly feature what's perceived by a lot of guys to be, senseless woman stuff, when that's simply not the case, lads. If you put that pride aside, you would find that a story about a high school girl that lives in a house with a bunch of furries can be just or even more impactful than a Viking story about an angry little kid that learns that killing people is bad. Yeah, I said it. Toru Honda and her philosophy over Thorfinn. F you if you disagree. I spoke to my professor recently about why men refuse to watch female-oriented media, just to make sure that I wasn't talking out of my backside, and we came to an agreement that this stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of manhood, and it reveals itself in a need to say, I'm a man and I don't care about what the other gender does. This attitude has always struck me as bizarre, as it perpetuates a very narrow and rigid concept of masculinity that dismisses the values of understanding and empathy across gender lines. How can you be a good father if you can't understand your daughter? How can you be a good husband if you can't understand your wife? Or more importantly, how can you be a good person if you're not willing to understand another. And it's important to acknowledge this because fictional empathy shapes real life perspectives. It's been proven. People draw empathy from fictional characters and stories, and it influences who they are. And if we take an even darker dive into that area of male-oriented media, we see how a lot of weak men today who end up becoming these, edgelords, incels, whatever the you want to call it, a lot of the time comes from self-inserting themselves into these stories that ironically critiques the very thing that they find appealing about said character. Multiple people have made videos and articles about this epidemic, and it's very clear to see where these negative interpretations come from. I want to regain power that stems from a feeling of loneliness and feeling rejected by society / not feeling satisfied with it. My own conclusion of this is that what it means is that men struggle when it comes to finding, creating and understanding meaningful relationships and confronting them instead of destroying them. In the context of anime and manga, for example, it manifests itself in guys justifying characters like Light, Eren, Johan, Griffith, etc., which after making 2 very well researched video essays analyzing them is a very scary reality that people aren't acknowledging. Just go on Reddit, bro. Genuinely, you want to see how bad this shit gets, just go on Reddit. Now, many people in academic fields have tried to find a solution to these dangerous rabbit holes that men fall into, but funnily enough, might sound a little bit corny, might sound a little bit crazy, but I think you can find that cure with shoujo. Dare I say they specialize in showcasing the struggle of fitting in and feeling ostracized by society, and how that trauma affects you and in turn the relationships you have with other people. Yeah, that's literally all I have to say about the topic. Here's some recommendations, some of my favorite shoujo stories ever. Yeah, that's about it for this video. Genuinely, I don't know what the fuck this video is at this point. Originally, it was like a 3-hour love letter to shoujo, and I ended up cutting so much of it out. I hope it still turned out good. Anyways, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, once again, liking and subscribing means the world to me. Lets me know that I did some good with my time. Also, I try my best to upload once a month. Got big plans for the rest of the year, so don't forget to turn on the bell notification, and God bless, peace out, have a good day / week / month / year.